And it's not well known that nearly every year for the last 2 decades, we have seen more countries regress than improve in providing freedom to their citizens.
Jan Egeland has served as Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council since 2013. He has over 30 years of experience from international work with human rights, humanitarian crisis and conflict resolution. He gave the ICORN Lecture at the Kapittel Festival in 2025, which marks 20 years since the founding of the International Cities of Refuge network in Stavanger.
We are meeting in a fantastic cathedral, which is nearly 1,000 years old. And this medieval building predates the Enlightenment period and the global human rights that we are here to discuss, we're here to defend, we're here to promote. I'm proud that Stavanger, my hometown originally, is on the forefront on the fight to protect and promote freedoms of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of belief internationally. And today the city, Stavanger, and our country enjoy a high degree of respect for and guarantees of these fundamental human rights, which in turn is tied to the rule of law and the protection against unlawful detention, repression, and violence. But it wasn't always like this here. So back to these ancient stones, they have witnessed a lot of repression. The first bishop of Stavanger, Reinald, he was important for building of the church. He was hung by the Viking king Harald Gille in Bergen in 1135 on mere accusations that he knew where another Viking king had hidden his riches. In 1205, again, the representative of King Sverre, Einar Kongsmåg, he sought refuge in the western tower of the church from the armed bands called Baglerne, who was working on behalf of the Archbishop of Norway at the time. He was promised safe passage leaving the church, but he was betrayed and killed in the streets outside. The last bishop of this church was Haugsgjerd. He was detained during the Protestant Reformation, taken to Bergen, where he died in captivity. So for hundreds of years, these walls have seen the fair repression and arbitrary arrest and detention that the rest of the world is seeing today. The last time it was seen in town was, of course, during the Nazi German occupation from 1940 to 45, the time of our mother and father here in town. And this was when Norwegian freedom fighters were detained, tortured, killed. The city is proud that Trond Hegna, who was the editor-in-chief of 1st of May, today Rogalands Avis, in September 1940 had the iconic editorial, "No Norwegian for sale, ingen nordmann til salgs." It was a rally cry for the resistance to the Nazi occupation, and he ended up in Grini and sat 3 years in detention for his editorial. my point in going through all of this is that as our parents taught us, it is in no way evident that the freedom of expression, belief, and assembly we have today in Stavanger in Norway and in Scandinavia is guaranteed forever. And the very existence of the International Cities for Refuge network, ICORN, proves to us that in the world today, too many countries and too many artists, writers, journalists, and others live in the fear and under the same brutality that this church witnessed in previous times. So it should really be a pride for Stavanger that it hosts the ICORN network of 89 fellow human rights promoting cities across Europe and North America. It hosts 350 human rights defenders and have done so for 20 years. And it's important because now, in 2025, freedom of expression and assembly is under attack in too many countries. We must renew our fight for these fundamental human rights. And it's not well known that nearly every year for the last 2 decades, we have seen more countries regress than improve in providing freedom to their citizens. This decline in political rights, democracy, and civil liberties came after this period of great progress that we all saw after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. I was a pupil myself at the Kongsgård, the cathedral school next door, in the 1970s. Democracies were at the time in a minority worldwide. Dictatorships and authoritarian rule was the rule in most of the world. We formed an Amnesty International group among the students, and we adopted, as they were called at the time, prisoners of conscience. Some of them were detained, freedom fighters, detained in psychiatric institutions in the Soviet Union. Others were suffering torture and detention under military fascist dictatorships in Latin America. Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, etc. And then came the gigantic leap forward for democracy when the communist and the military dictatorships collapsed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I was convinced at the time that we would have a long, bumpy, but irreversible journey towards greater freedom, respect for human rights worldwide. I was convinced at the time. And when I was a Europe director for Human Rights Watch in 2011 and 2012, we felt that the Arab Spring was part of this great progress, and that the old repressive men would give way to young and hopeful democracies. I was wrong. The Arab Spring was crushed in one country after the other, and we saw more violence, repression, and war from Syria to Yemen, from Egypt to Tunisia. In Eastern Europe, Russia and other countries became increasingly authoritarian. Again, in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, we saw the same trend. So this led again to more persecution of writers, reporters, human rights activists that fled, if they were lucky, to ICORN cities where they got asylum and protection. But of course, most fled to miserable refugee camps and to uncertainty and potential further repression. And some had to do the life-dangerous journey across the Mediterranean to seek protection in Europe that at first welcomed them and now of late have built walls and barbed wire against those fleeing persecution and coming to our continent. At the beginning of this year, the human rights organization Freedom House took stock and measured the respect for 25 political rights and civil liberties across the 195 countries in the world. So what's the status? Well, there are now 85 nations that can be considered largely free. 51 are in the middle category of being under authoritarian rule. And as many as 59 countries are so-called not free. They are dictatorships, really. 110 countries are partially or totally repressive at the moment. Of course, this is extremely worrisome, even beyond the realm of democracy and the rule of law. I've been a humanitarian, human rights worker, conflict resolution worker for well over 40 years now. And what I've seen is that our success in bringing relief to populations in great need is directly correlated to the freedoms of thought and expression, the right of journalists and reporters and writers to record what is happening in the places where we try to bring relief. And then, of course, behind much of this is the surge in new and protracted armed conflicts on several continents. In 2024, we saw the highest number of state-based armed conflicts in over 7 decades. 61 armed conflicts in the world recorded across 36 countries. Some countries have several armed conflicts. My organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, we have 15,000 field workers, humanitarian workers. And my colleagues tell me that when they try to help the 10 million refugees and displaced that we give services to and protection to, they see more crossfire, more extreme armed actors, and therefore the number of people fleeing for their lives has been so dramatically on the rise. Remember, around 2010, 2011, we felt the number was high. There were 40 million people who have fled from conflict and violence. Today, it's more than 120 million. So 3 times more people flee from war and violence this year than 15 years ago. 3 times more. So, of course, that also leads to more needs for humanitarian relief. 300 million people desperately need aid, at the same time as global donors, led by the United States Trump administration, are cutting aid to those in desperate need. So, we're in the situation now that we plan to reach only 114 out of the 300 million in need, a third supposed to get aid. Not even those will get the aid, because we're not even getting half of the funding needed for this group. So, we need to then discuss, what do we do? What do we do? Because we need to reverse the declining trust in the multilateral global order and make peace diplomacy, also the fight for climate justice, important for Stavanger to discuss. I mean, some created climate change and got rich, and some are first and hardest hit, and it's not us. It's the people who did nothing to create climate change. Very poor people in places that are becoming unlivable because of climate change. And I think, again, Norway has the resources, connections, and possibilities to lead on many fronts in this good fight. So in my view, it was too bad that during this election campaign we just lived through, the world was really missing. The most privileged people on earth, I mean, look at the statistics. The safest, most privileged, richest people with the biggest and most well-funded welfare state in the world discussed how we can increase our welfare, increase our riches. One example of what was not discussed was the drastic cuts in the Norwegian refugee quota. Norway has for a generation given protection to people selected by the High Commissioner for Refugees to come and get protection. And some of them are under the ICORN program. So, my organization, NRC, and the United Nations have argued that Norway should take 5,000 per year. It would be just over 10 per municipality in the country. The compromise in our parliament was 3,000 per year. 3,000. And that was there as a level until 2023. Today, Norway is receiving 500. It's one per municipality, really. And that's now the new consensus. In a world where there is more need for asylum, for protection, for people fleeing for their life, defending global human rights and paying a price for it, we're cutting the number of spaces for asylum. I think we need to change that. And also, we need to have better instruments to fight impunity, which is that people really, repressive leaders, warlords, and others are getting away with murder. This year is on track to be the deadliest on record in humanitarian work. So, we have colleagues, aid workers, that were killed all over the world, 265 killed so far this year. It's on track to be the deadliest on record. Since 2022, the number of aid workers killed annually has more than doubled. Of course, most of this increase is because of Gaza, because of Israel's indiscriminate attack on civilians, on aid workers, and on journalists in Gaza. Since 7th of October 2023, at least 508 aid workers have been killed in Gaza. So the number of journalists then has also continued to grow that have sustained attacks. More journalists were killed in 2024 than in any other year since the Committee to Protect Journalism began collecting data more than 30 years ago. At least 124 journalists and media workers were killed last year, nearly 2/3 of them Palestinian media staff killed by Israeli bombardment. As aid workers, we need journalists and writers to be there with us and witness what is happening when lives are at stake. When Israel blocks all access for all international media to get into Gaza, we're reliant on the local Palestinian journalists to bear witness. And when they are routinely killed, the story is not getting out. We also, in addition to all of this, need to have international global diplomacy become more effective again. But with relations between the great powers in the deep freezer and the West against Russia, the US against China, we who work for freedom of expression or for humanitarian work get no help from a paralyzed UN Security Council. So it's more a lonely battle, perhaps, than before, but we cannot and will not give up. We can all do more in this battle of values and for the defense of human rights and fundamental freedoms. It is a struggle we cannot lose and which we can and must win. And I'm back to Stavanger. I'm proud that my old town has played an important role and can and will play an important role for all of this also in the future. In the 1990s, I was a young state secretary for foreign affairs in Oslo, but I was glad to see that we could support free radio stations for Nigeria, a military dictatorship at the time, for Burma or Myanmar, again military dictatorship at the time. The free radio stations, a little bit like the radios, the free radio station from London, the Voice of London to the Norwegians under occupation, those free radio stations were beaming from Kvitsøy, shortwave relay station, and not far from here. So, I hope the city will continue to be providing free, protected space for those who are refugees because of repression. I hope it will also be a place that can speak truth to power and make sure that Norway energizes our international solidarity with the world's most betrodden. It is a city that is many times more prosperous than it was when I grew up many years ago here. So it must have the resources, the possibilities to do so. And Stavanger has always been, like Norway, a place that has been looking outward. The city has been a seafaring, shipping, trading place for more than 1,000 years. Migration from here to America started from here. So, being among the most privileged and peaceful nations on earth, and having become rich on trading with the world, we need to be among the first to stand up for universal rights also for those who lack them. So I'm sure that Stavanger will continue to do so. If not us, who can? Thank you.